Hello, and in this video I want to address protests that took place on the day that the NATO flag was hoisted in the building of the adjacent to the building of the Swedish Parliament in Stockholm. And the Communist Party Youth, the RKU, Revolutionär Kommunistiska Ungdom, staged protests against this, and it was reported on the Kommunistiska Partij feed on X. And Kommunistiska Partij is a Marxist-Leninist political organization in Sweden. And Kommunistiska Partij, there you go, Kommunistiska Partij, the Communist Party. Our youth organization RKU stood today stood up for peace and protested as the NATO flag was hoisted outside the Parliament building. Yes to peace, no to NATO. And here it is. So you can look at what I just read right here. This is the Swedish. I just paraphrased it, but yeah. So that's it. And then there is the kids from the RKU right here. It's a small picture of the RKU kids protesting against it. And if you notice, not only do they have NATO, not to NATO, they're also flying the Palestinian flag, right? Because NATO endorses the genocide, the war of genocide against Palestine. So NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, unconditionally supports and endorses the Israeli war of genocide against Palestine. And that is why the RKU, the young people in the Revolutionär Kommunistiska Ungdom, the Revolutionary Communist Youth are, when they were protesting against NATO, they were also flying the Palestinian flag. So the Palestinian flag is the effective reply to the NATO flag. That's it. From the Kommunistiska Partij, right? So yeah, so the Kommunistiska Partij right here, right? And again, the Kommunistiska Partij is one of two Marxist-Leninist communist parties in Sweden. Yeah, and I just wanted to point out over here, right? The article appeared, of course, this comes from an article in Aftonbladet. Aftonbladet is one of the Swedish media organs, private media organs. Here it is, hoisting the NATO flag next to the Parliament building, right? Right. So, I mean, NATO and of course the king. Here's the king of Sweden giving a speech. The king of Sweden. Imagine that. Here, look, is the NATO flag flying in the Parliament building. The NATO flag, right? The NATO flag flying in the Parliament building. This is from the Aftonbladet video or whatever. The NATO flag. Okay, so basically now Sweden has been annexed. Right now, the Swedish military is no longer under the control of the Swedish state. The Swedish military is now basically the Swedish-speaking division of the American military. The NATO command structure so dictates that it is the Pentagon who ultimately has the final military decisions in NATO. So now basically all that's left of the Swedish state is the oligarchy of parliamentary politicians, the nomenclatura of faceless bureaucrats that administer the Swedish state, and the police as their armed fist. The military is no longer under the effective control of the Swedish state, because now the Swedish military does not answer to the interests of the Swedish state. The Swedish military is required to put first the geostrategic interests of American imperialism. And here you have, just so that you know, if you want to find, Swedish Marxist-Leninist perspectives and coverage of the NATO issue, you can go to Proletaren, and Proletaren is probably one of the two Marxist-Leninist communist newspapers in Sweden, and they have a whole section on NATO. And they point out here, for example, that Sweden will have to pay 2 to 3%. Well, if it does, right? Most of the NATO countries don't pay it. I think it's only Britain who pays a 2 to 3% NATO fee, right? But let's pretend that Sweden is probably going to pay up, right? Let's pretend that they do, because it will be a perfect opportunity to cut social services, and the moderates love that. The moderate government would love that. So, but it says here, there is an article in the NATO thing, in the Proletaren. Proletaren is one of the two Swedish Marxist-Leninist newspapers. There is coverage there about the crisis in the Swedish healthcare system, which will be aggravated because budget cuts are going to have to be made to healthcare, education, and other social services to pay the 2%, 2 to 3% GDP NATO membership fee. So they brought that up, yeah, in an article in Proletarian. So the Swedish healthcare system in crisis, and then they have, of course, Sweden out of NATO. Swedish out of NATO. That's a new slogan, right? Swedish out of NATO. So take Sweden out of NATO. Here it is. It's very ur NATO, right? It's very ur NATO, right? Or coverage, and yeah. And it says here, the Swedish membership in NATO is constitutes a full endorsement of the interests of American imperialism. So yeah, and yeah. So here it is. So Sweden is now a satrap of American imperialism. Sweden is now effectively an American satellite. The same way as, let's say, Mongolia was in relation to the Soviet Union. Yeah, or I don't know, the German Democratic Republic in relation to the Soviet Union. It's the same thing now with Sweden and the United States, basically. So, I mean, very little is left of Swedish sovereignty between the European Union and now the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Very little is left of Swedish sovereignty. So it is very interesting that the King of Sweden gave a speech when they hoisted the NATO flag next to the Parliament building in Stockholm, because precisely so, that the fact that the NATO flag is now a sovereign flag flying over Stockholm overturns a big chunk of Swedish independence and sovereignty. I mean, basically, what Gustav Vasa, who was the king who founded the Swedish nation state in the 1530s, I mean, precisely so, he led a peasant rebellion against the Kalmar Union and declared independence for Sweden. That has now been effectively overturned. So it is very interesting that the current king of Sweden gives a speech endorsing Sweden's satellite status in complete opposition to what Gustav Vasa, who is the king who founded, the Swedish nation state in the 1530s, did. So basically, the current king has renounced Gustav Vasa and his project. Okay, that's the state of things. But not all Swedes agree, and here they are. The Swedes who don't agree are reproletariat, right? And it's very hard of NATO. It's very hard of NATO, right? If you want to find out what Swedes who oppose NATO think, go to Proletariat and look at the section, NATO section, and you will find arguments. Here's another article that appears in Proletariat. Sweden in the NATO war machine, right? And it's more an analytical argument as to why Sweden should leave NATO. It's very heavy of NATO. So, yeah. Alliance friheten död, right? The alliance free status is now dead, right? Yeah. So, a nuclear weapon alliance, NATO. Yeah, and this is the empire, right? The NATO empire, right? It's absorbed all the territories NATO has absorbed, right? It's like I said before, between the European Union and NATO, there is very little left of Sweden, a war alliance, in Krigalliance, right? An American war alliance,